I'm a girl. My mom was a horrible addict. She barely took care of me as a child. At the time of this incident, I was around 6 or 7, so my awareness and understanding of things happening may not totally make much sense. This all happened in the 90s. One night, my mother and I were on a car ride. I wasn't sure why we were driving, but it was late at night. I'm not sure what time it was either, but I assume it was very late because there weren't any cars on the street, and I was sleeping in the back seat. I don't even remember getting into the car. My mom drove up to some sketchy house and left me in the car for what felt like forever. Suddenly, the car door swung open, and someone violently grabbed me by the arm and yanked me out of the car. I started screaming and crying until the man that had grabbed me looked me in the eyes and said, "Be quiet and don't try to run or I'll kill you." He had a scruffy beard and looked just like a madman. I was scared to death, so I listened. He held me tight by the arm, shut the car door, and walked with me down the street. I looked back at the house my mom was in, hoping that my mom would come out at the last second and save me. I looked at the house as long as I could, as the man dragged me further and further away. As we walked down the street, I wanted to cry, but I was in shock and fear. I didn't know what to do. If I sniffled or cried at all, the man would tighten his grip and yell at me. I can't even explain how scared and confused I was. We walked for a little while, and finally ended up in the projects. The projects were a bunch of buildings crammed together in a shitty neighborhood. We walked into one of the buildings and started to walk up a flight of stairs. My legs and feet hurt like hell at this point, but I was too scared to stop moving or complain. We walked up another flight of stairs when I saw a random man smoking a cigarette in the stairway. Then, without warning, the guy that kidnapped me fell to the ground. It happened so fast. I didn't know how the kidnapper fell to the ground so fast, but the next thing I remember is the cigarette man was punching and kicking the kidnapper in his head and face. The kidnapper was out cold. The cigarette man picked up the kidnapper by the back of his jacket and threw him straight down the stairs. You have no idea how scary and violent it is to see an unconscious man fall down the stairs. To this day, I still have a fear of them. He bled everywhere. I have no idea how the man with the cigarette knew to help me, but I'm glad he did. Maybe he could see the tears in my eyes. Maybe he just picked up on something and had a bad vibe, but he acted instantly. The first second he could, he attacked my would-be kidnapper. The cigarette man started pacing back and forth, swearing at himself and gritting his teeth, clenching his fists together. I thought he was mad at me, so I started to cry. He looked at me and said, Okay, shut up." He had an attitude to him, so I listened to him out of fear. I wasn't as scared of this man as much as the bearded guy, but I still was afraid. He started to ask me questions with a bit of an attitude. "Why are you out this late? Where are your parents? Why would you even talk to strangers?" I was in so much shock and confusion, I couldn't answer the man's questions correctly. He asked me if I knew my way home, and I told him that I didn't. I told him a broken story about what happened, and somehow with the information I gave him, he knew where my mom's car was. The only thing I remember about the road is passing a house with Christmas lights on it, despite Christmas already being over. I think he knew the area well enough, and figured out where I needed to go from that information, but I honestly don't ever remember telling him about the Christmas lights. Anyways, he promised he would take me back if I promised over and over that I wouldn't tell the police that I saw him, or anyone that looked like him, and made me promise that I wouldn't even tell the police anything. He had an attitude, and I didn't care what he asked me. I just wanted to go back to my mom, so I agreed. I followed him down the stairs. The bearded man was still laying on the ground, bleeding out at the bottom of the stairs. He wasn't moving at all. For all I know, he was dead, and I kind of hope he was. The cigarette man stepped over the bearded guy, and I followed. He walked outside, and he looked a bit panicky. I remember him telling me over and over, "The police don't like me." We walked out of the projects, and my feet still hurt a bit. The man was walking fast in a panic, and I had to basically jog to keep up with him. I started crying, and he asked me what was wrong. I told him my feet hurt, and I remember him sucking his teeth and picking me up. He awkwardly cradled me in both arms, and he walked down the road for a moment. Then I remember him swearing and running behind a house or a building. A cop car was driving down the road. He put me down and told me to run to the police car. I tried to run, but my legs could barely move, and I was scared. The car kept driving and rode away without seeing me, before I could even remotely get close to it. He kept swearing to himself as he picked me up again and ran down the street. He took me behind a lot of houses and hid from every cop car that drove by. I assumed now that the police were looking for me. He carried me in both arms, running fast down the road, when I saw my mom in her car in the distance. She was surrounded by police. The man put me down and told me to go over to her. I got so excited the pain in my legs disappeared. He put me down and ran away in the other direction. I ran towards the police and my mom. My mom picked me up and hugged me tight. The police started to ask me and my mom questions. I don't remember too much about their questions, but I remember my mom telling the police some convoluted story that didn't make any sense. She basically told me not to say anything, and I didn't say much but cried a whole bunch. We went home. Days later, my dad picked me up and knew right away that something was wrong. I told him everything that had happened, and I never lived with my mom again. When I grew up, I had time to think about that day. I never forgave my mother. Not too long ago, I asked my dad what he remembers about the situation, and he told me what he thinks happened from what I explained to him from years ago. He said my mom was on a drug binge. I got kidnapped and someone saved me, but the person that saved me had warrants out for him. He wasn't mad at me. He was just frustrated with the situation that he had to deal with. Imagine being a criminal on the run, and now you have a kidnapped girl with you, and you just beat a guy half to death. If he would have gotten caught with me, he could be in jail for my kidnapping. With my mom lying and me being in shock and confused, I wouldn't be able to tell them that the man had helped me, because while it was all happening, I didn't even notice that he was. So, to the man that saved me, thanks. So in my life, there have only been a few times I've ever looked back and thought I really could have been killed or something. This is one of them. It was back in 2010, when I had just started college. I had arrived pretty early, as I figured traffic would be much worse than it turned out to be. To kill some time, I decided to go to a Wal-Mart right across the street. After shopping some Magic the Gathering and buying some food, I made my way out, and once I stepped off the curb, a man stopped me. This guy was probably between his late 30s and early 40s, and very unkempt looking. Ripped jeans that looked old, a shirt that was faded and looked like it had once had a design or writing on it, and a baseball cap that appeared to be the only new thing he had on. Once he stopped me, he started up with, "Hey man, I hate to be a bother, but I was doing some construction work up the road, and my truck ran out of gas. Can you help me out and drive with me to the nearest gas station? I'm alone and pretty desperate." Obviously that seemed pretty sketchy, so I instead offered to give him $10 I had on me, thinking it might really be a guy down on his luck. To my surprise, he immediately shot down my offer and instead continued to insist I instead let him drive me to the gas station in his truck, pay for his gas, and then he'd drive me back. Needless to say, this all seemed incredibly bizarre, and I told him no and that I was in a hurry. Instead of leaving it alone, he began to tell me, "Man, come on. I'm all alone here and my truck is on E. I'm stranded here by myself." When I continued to walk away, he began to try to grab at my arm while continuing to beg. I realized quickly that with the way we were positioned, every time he went to grab at me and I walked away, he was leading me more and more away from the store and more toward the parking lot, which was not very full this early in the morning. Not wanting to let him keep leading me away, I walked back toward the store and said I had forgotten something inside. Instead of following me, he quickly backed off once I made it to the doors. I think he didn't want to go inside and risk other people seeing him. This may sound like overreacting, but at this point I was freaking out. I had never had someone actually try and grab me like that, and every bad scenario was running in my head. Not wanting him to do this with anyone else, I alerted the front desk of what was going on, and they told me they'd handle it. Honestly, I don't know if they did or didn't, because I quickly went for the other exit and nearly ran for my car. Once I was finally in my car, I noticed that the man was walking away from his spot, and I assumed they had either kicked him out or he was simply admitting defeat for the day. I was curious, so I watched him walk to the back of the parking lot and get in his truck. My heart sank when he pulled away, and I noticed two heads pop up from the back seats, as if they were hiding out of view until the car was moving. To make matters even more sketchy, he did not pull into the nearest gas station, and instead continued on and pulled onto the highway. Obviously not something someone alone and running out of gas would do. Fast forward 2 days later, and I stop at the same Wal-Mart, and what do I find? Yup, it was him. Still there, and still giving the same story about being stranded and needing someone to follow him. This time, instead of telling the store, I immediately called the police. I don't know if he recognized me and saw me on the phone or what, but he left pretty immediately after that, and I never saw him in that parking lot again. Sorry if it's not as interesting as some of the other stories, but this is easily one of the scariest moments in my life. When I say he was trying to grab at me, I mean he was trying very hard. Like if he had grabbed me, he wasn't gonna let go. I don't know what he was planning, but I assume he figured a Wal-Mart near a college would be an easy area to trick naive college kids. First time posting, so play nice. This is 100% true, and I wanted to post it for a while, but I guess I was too scared until recently. This happened a couple of years ago now, but it's easily the scariest I've ever been through. I was doing my second year of my degree, so I worked at a well-known fast food restaurant. I don't want to get sued or whatever, but y'all are probably familiar with it. I was pretty good at my job, not that it was particularly difficult. I started off doing day shifts, which is when most of the staff worked. Places like that are a revolving door employment-wise. I worked there for 7 months, and I may as well have been a lifer. While working there, I worked for a time alongside a dude named Frank. Frank was older than me. I was 20 at the time, and I guessed he was in his early 30s. He had a pleasant-ish demeanor most of the time, but the dude was dumb as a pole. He constantly did things wrong, and was absolutely frustrating most of the time. More than that, though, he was just kind of weird. He just did weird things that didn't make sense to anyone but him. Because of this, I barely spoke to him unless I absolutely had to, and I wasn't all that bummed out when they decided to fire him. As far as I knew, that would be the last I ever saw of him, and I was pretty indifferent about it, other than the vague relief that I wouldn't have to work with someone incompetent again. A few months went on, and I was eventually moved to the morning shift. We're talking about 5 a.m. to 12 p.m. It sucked, but it meant I had afternoons free most of the time, which meant I could get ahead with university work. I generally only worked weekends, and any weekday that I didn't have university. At the time the story happened, I'd already found a new job, and I was on my final day of working for this fast food place. I actually had my first shift at the new place at 4 p.m. that day. I wasn't planning to work, but my manager begged me to train the new girl, and I agreed. I'd still have a couple of hours to change and nap after my shift, so I guessed it was no big deal. The day fell on a Wednesday, which I never usually worked, and I wasn't rotated to work on it. That's important to remember. So I get to the store at 5 a.m. and start training the new girl as usual. Everything is going pretty chill, and as per usual up until about 7 a.m. I look over the counter and see a familiar face. There was a line of customers, but he wasn't standing in it, more like next to it. I gave a brief, "Hi, Frank," and turned back to what I was doing. We weren't friends, and had barely ever spoken. I hadn't seen him in about 6 months, so I didn't want to have to give him any more of my time. The dude kept lingering there, though. He asked me how I was, and I said fine and asked him back. He said he'd found a new job, and I sort of nodded, but I was serving customers, and to be honest, I didn't really want to keep up a conversation. Then the really weird stuff began. He asked me if I wanted to hang out sometime, to which I snorted and said no. The woman I was serving gave an amused smile, which I returned. Frank wasn't sated, though. He asked again, and when I said no, he asked why. I said that I had a partner and that I was busy. He asked what I was busy with. I said that I was going to my hometown, which was true. I was going to do that after my shift at my new place, to see my mom. He asked what was there and why I was going. Frustrated, I told him that I was busy and that I needed to get back to work. It's been a couple of years, and honestly this was pretty traumatic, so I don't fully remember the events that happened next. What I do remember is that suddenly he started acting really weird. He was staring at me with wide eyes, like he didn't know what was going on. He walked around to the employee door and tried to go in. At that point, I ran over and held my hands up to him, not touching him, pointedly not touching him. I told him he couldn't come back here and that he had to leave right away. He was sweating by now and staring at me. He sort of mumbles something, sounding like he's agreeing with me, and even steps back a little. I tell him that he has to leave, that he has to go right now. One of the other customers sees this and says firmly, "Are you going to leave or what?" To which Frank nods but makes no move to actually go. He just stands there shaking. The problem with working in crappy places is that nothing works, so the employee door didn't lock. I closed the door anyway, and moved back so I was on the stairs up to the office, so I could see the CCTV feed. I look at the feed from the one pointed at the employee door, and he's just standing there staring at the door, unmoving. Meanwhile, the new girl is still serving customers, by the way. I was scared, so I texted my manager, who told me she was on her way, and just to hold tight. He was still standing there, so I asked her if it was okay to head up to the office, which she said was fine. It wasn't too busy, and honestly I wouldn't care if it was, so I head upstairs to the office. Just as I get there, I hear the voice of the new girl shouting, "Wait! Stop! You can't go up there!" And holy shit, I turn around and see Frank, dazed out of his mind, crawling up the stairs towards me. His eyes are wild, and he looks completely out of it. Once again, I hold up my hands and tell him to leave, but this time he seems completely incapable of listening. He just keeps walking towards me. I tell my manager in all caps, he's upstairs. Remember what I said about working in crappy places? Nothing works, which meant the door to the office didn't lock either. As he approached me, I slammed the door shut and pressed my back up against it. I was hoping that because he seemed so strung out, I didn't know if it was drugs or just some sort of mental break, he would just leave, but he didn't. The dude starts pushing on the door, grunting and moaning, and I felt like I was 100% in a horror movie. At this point, I just decide to call the police. I'm screaming on the phone to this girl, shaking. I've never had to call any sort of emergency services before or since, so the whole thing was just terrifying to me. And bear in mind, he's pushing and slamming on the door as I'm doing all this. She's asking me if I know what he wants, or if he has a weapon, and it dawns on me suddenly that I have no idea. As soon as the dispatch girl hangs up, I hear my manager's voice talking very firmly and sternly to Frank. From what I can tell, he sounds like he's sort of responding to her. I call out that I've called the police, and I don't move from the door. I hear the police soon enough, and they convince him to come downstairs. As he's going, he asks softly if I can come, at which point I scream, "What the hell?" because that was the last straw. Soon enough, a police officer knocks on the door and tells me they've taken him outside. He comes in and takes my statement. He tells me that all they could do was let him go since he didn't break the law. They said he didn't seem to be on drugs either. I'm scared, but I'm just sort of glad he's gone. You'd think that's where the ordeal ends, but apparently Frank had a little prequel in mind for me. After this whole thing, I grab my phone to text my partner, and I notice I've got a new email. I check it, and it's from about 6:30 that morning, from Frank. I don't remember all that was said, but it was essentially saying hello, asking how I was. He asked in the email if I'd like to go out sometime, and that I'd had a great impact on his life. I show my manager, and she guesses that he got my email from one of the email threads she used to send with the rotas attached. Remember earlier, though, how I said I hadn't been rotated to work on this day? That I never worked on Wednesdays? That he left before I started the early shifts. There was, in theory, no way he would know that I would be there, and yet somehow he did. I passed this info on to the police, who told me they still couldn't do anything, but that if I ever saw him in public again, even if he wasn't doing anything, to call them right away. I called my new workplace and very briefly explained the situation. They were nice and said I didn't have to come in that day, and that they hoped I was okay. My partner brought me home and helped calm me down while I sat, terrified and paranoid in my bed, until I eventually made my way back to my mom's place, which was far enough away that I felt safe. I eventually moved out of that town, but only 2 months ago. Up until then, I saw him everywhere I went, and I feared what would happen every time I saw him. Thankfully, up until now, I never have. I was watching my daughter's kids while she and her husband go out of town. They have a teenage daughter. Let's say her name is Alyssa. At about 3 a.m., I'm woken up by a weird rustling sound, and I look out the window and see movement. I saw a boy emerge from the bushes on the side of the house. I saw a bike tossed on the lawn that definitely wasn't ours. My first thought was that it was a burglar casing houses, but since he looked to be young and came on a bike, I figured scaring him straight would be enough for him to decide to head home. I didn't want to ruin a teenager's life by calling the cops straight away. So I went out on the porch, flipped the lights on, and said, "Can I help you?" in my classroom voice. The guy looked surprised but not nervous. He was wearing a Letterman-style jacket, but once I got a clear view of him in the streetlights, he seemed much older than my granddaughter. gruff, and more wiry than athletic. He walked up closer to the house and said, "Yeah, I'm looking for Alyssa." I gave him a disapproving glare, hoping he'd realize he came looking for a girl late at night, and a grumpy old person answered, "It's time to split." I'm thinking what must have happened is Alyssa knew her parents were going out of town, and maybe before she knew I'd be staying over, told a secret older boyfriend to come on over. It was late and I was alone with several kids, so I didn't want him coming any closer to the house. I also thought it was weird he came so late, and wanted to be sure Alyssa actually wanted to talk to him. So I said, "I'm sorry, who?" And he said Alyssa. You know, Alyssa, and then her last name. This is her house. I thought he knew her full name, so they must at least be friends. I told him to wait there. He started to walk up, and I felt a sickening burning in my gut. Instinct kicked in, and I yelled, "No, stop!" Then I readjusted and said, "Stay right there. This is a private property, so don't take a step closer. Wait there." I go in, and Alyssa is asleep just one room over from where the rustling first occurred. I wake her up and say something to the effect of, "I don't know what the big idea was to have friends over this time of night, but you tell them to go home." She has no clue what I'm talking about. I say, "There's a man outside waiting for you." She gets confused, gets up and goes to the window. She sees him and goes as white as a sheet. "He asked for me?" "Yeah." "By name?" "Yes." "Call the police. I've never seen that man before in my life." I called 911 immediately, but as I was on the phone with them, Alyssa started tugging on my arm. "He's coming up." I had younger kids in the house to think about, so I kept the door latched and pulled it just open enough for the latch. I yelled, "I asked my husband, and none of us know this person. Leave my property now or I'm calling 911. He got angry and started yelling for her to come out. Thankfully, the police came pretty quickly, and when he heard the sirens, he grabbed his bike and ran off. I watched where he was running to, and he jumped into the passenger side of a car without headlights or front plates and sped right off. The police followed in the same direction once I pointed them out, but they didn't get him. They advised us to take all her social media details offline if she was sure she didn't know this person, and said they'd had a couple similar reports recently and were looking into the problem. I got a heavy-duty lock, and she slept in my room for the remainder of my visit. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. As always, be sure to let me know what you guys think, and please feel free to like, comment, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. I know some people have also had some problems about videos not appearing in their sub box, so please make sure to hit that little bell if you guys want to always be notified of when my next video comes out. As always, links to all of my social media will be in the description of the video below. You can find links to my Twitter, Gmail, Twitch, and Facebook accounts. So if you guys ever want to talk to me, just go ahead and shoot me a message on any of those, and I'll try to respond to your message as soon as possible. I'm also going to start trying to stream on Twitch a little bit more, so if you guys have notifications on there, you'll be notified right away when I go live. I might also try to do some on YouTube, but I haven't decided yet. I'm still kind of trying to decide what kind of streams I want to do. Anyways, if you guys have a story you would like to send in, or if you have a story you would like to suggest that I read, go ahead and send me a message on any of those links in the description below. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include the title, how you would like to be credited, and any genres that the story might have, if it does have one. If you guys are curious about the music used in this video, go ahead and take a look in the description below as well. I always put all of the music in the order in which it appears in the video, and I also have links to the artists as well. Last but not least, I also have a Patreon if you guys feel like you want to contribute to the channel a little bit. But of course, as always, it is never required and you will never have to pay for watching any of my videos. So that's just something you do if you feel like it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and please be sure to leave your feedback in the comments below. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you very much.